This lesson is on integers and absolute value. So let's just start with some vocabulary to make sure we know what integers and absolute value are. Integers are just all of the positive and negative whole numbers. So all the whole numbers that you would picture on a number line, for example, -1, -2, 0. We do include 0. We'll put that on here, even though 0 is not really counted as a positive or a negative number. So we'll put some of our examples. -1, 5, 1 million would be an integer. Not anything with decimals or fractions because those aren't whole numbers. So going from integers, let's talk about what absolute value is then. Absolute value is just a number's distance from 0. So let's put that. A number's distance from 0 on that number line. So if you start at 0 and you go either positive or negative toward a number and count how many steps you take, that's its absolute value. So what that means for us is the absolute value is always positive, because it doesn't matter if you're going down to a -7, you're going to take 7 steps away from 0 on that number line. Its absolute value would be 7. It's always going to be a positive number. All right, then let's talk about opposites. So opposites, we'll do an example first. An example of opposites would be 5 and -5. And those are considered opposites because they have the same distance from 0 on the number line. If you start at 0 and you walk to 5, you go 5 steps. You walk to -5, you go 5 steps. So they're considered opposites. We'll put they have the same distance from 0 on different sides of the number line. So on different sides. Let's do that. Let's make this a little bit brighter here. See if that works a little better. Okay. So let's look at the examples and see if we can just write the absolute value and the opposite of each of these integers that they give us, these positive and negative whole numbers. So the absolute value of -1, how many spaces is -1 away from 0? 1 space. The opposite of -1, what's the opposite of that? On the other side of 0 on the number line would just be +1. So both the absolute value and opposite of -1 are actually the same number. The absolute value of 105, well, it's 105 spaces from 0, but the opposite is on the other side of the 0. It's going to be -105. And if we look at this one, okay, we've got to figure out what this means. We probably should go back up to absolute value because these are the absolute value symbols. You're going to have lines like that on either side of a number. So the absolute value up here of 5 would be written like this with those symbols. So what is this really saying? Let me zoom in a little bit. Right here, this is the absolute value of -60. So what does that really mean? How many spaces is -60 from 0? 60 spaces. So really, that whole thing just stands for 60. Well, now what's the absolute value of 60? How many spaces is 60 from 0? 60. What's the opposite of 60? -60. So that's some practice with just figuring out what the absolute value and what the opposite is. Okay, another thing we need to do with integers is to be able to just put them in order from the least to the greatest or the greatest to the least. We've got to pay attention to what we're being asked so that we know what order to do this in. Let's just look at the numbers, and there's one of them that we have to look at that has these absolute value symbols around it. We've got to ask ourselves, what does that really mean? What is the absolute value of -6? How many spaces is it away from 0? Well, 6. So that really just stands for a 6. So if we're going to put these in order, picture a number line. Which one's going to be the least, all the way to the left on the number line? The very smallest number, it would be -10. So let's start with -10. I'm going to cross it off my list so I know I used it. We know that the other negative numbers are going to be smallest. So -5 is the next smallest. And then we've got -2. So those take care of all the negative numbers. And then we go to the positive ones to get bigger here. Let's see, what's our smallest positive number? That would be our 6 that we figured out right up here. Then we've got 7, and we've got 9. So we put them in order from least to greatest, making sure we took care of figuring out what that absolute value really meant. Okay, this was where it gets kind of crazy. we've got example 3 and 4 here, where we're going to practice actually writing out expressions with integers. Now, it gives us a hint here that for these examples, this is really important, a negative sign can also be read out loud as the opposite of. Let's see what this means. So if we had a negative sign, we had, like, say, -7, I could also read that out loud as -7 or the opposite of 7. Does that make sense? Even isn't -7 the opposite of 7? So we can read that negative sign as the opposite of, and that might help us to do these. So we're going to do example 3, write the integer expression that corresponds with this verbal expression here, the verbal one in words. So we want to write out the opposite of -5. I don't want to know what the actual answer is, I just want to be able to write that so people can read it out loud. The opposite of, what was the opposite of? We could say a negative sign, right? The opposite of -5. Well, -5 we could write out as -5 like this. But we can't just have a negative and a negative next to each other. We need to do something to separate those. So what we use in math just to separate them is parentheses. So if somebody were to look at this and they were to read it out loud, they would say either -5, which we really don't say because it doesn't make much sense to us, or you could say the opposite of -5. Now, if I asked you to tell me what that really was, would you be able to? What is the opposite of -5? It would be 5. But right here, we're not being asked to even say that. We just want to write it out as an expression. So let's try B. The opposite of the absolute value of -6. Okay, so let's start with opposite of. How do we write opposite of? A negative sign. The opposite of the absolute value of, so we know we're going to have to do an absolute value symbol like this. And what is it the absolute value of? -6. So that's going to go inside our absolute value symbol. Okay, so that's putting it from English words into the math symbols. The next example asks us to take these math symbols and actually simplify them. So simplify means find what they actually stand for. So let's try. This one right out here. Let's see if we can read it out loud. We could say -10, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense to us. What if we said this first one is the opposite of? If you say that to yourself, what's the opposite of -10? And think about that in your head. The opposite of -10 is +10. It's just 10. That's all that stands for. Zoom in a little bit more here. So that just stands for 10. That whole thing simplifies down to 10. Let's try this one with some more crazy negative signs in it. Okay, we've got a whole bunch of stuff going on. When you've got a ton of stuff, start with the inside and work your way out. So we're starting in here, and we'd say that out loud as -34. Okay? Now, add this little guy onto it. We could say the opposite of -34. So everything in here, what does that really stand for? The opposite of -34 is just 34. But we've still got this guy way out there then. So now what's the opposite of 34? Now we get to -34. And that is our simplified expression here. So again, we had the opposite of a negative, which made it positive, and then the opposite of a positive, which made it negative. Let's try C. For C, we've got all the way on the inside here these absolute values. The absolute value of 12. What does that really mean? How many steps away from 0 is 12? Just 12. So that whole thing in there really just means 12. And then we've got this negative over here, so we can think about it as -12, or the opposite of 12, which is -12. So we've got a -12 in those parentheses, and then we've got another negative way out here. What is -12, or the opposite of -12? That's going to make it +12. So remember that real cool trick about saying negative out loud as the opposite of right up here, and that's going to help you simplify those expressions when you get to them.